Roman governors lived here. They would visit Jerusalem, but they didn't like it because Jerusalem is a Jewish city, lots of revolts, lots of problems. They weren't liked there. They were hated there by most people except the politicians. So, for instance, when Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem, that he was there only for a week or two during Passover because that's when all the bad stuff would happen, all the violence would break out. Otherwise, he lived here. So this is Pontius Pilate's residence. It was also the residence of a governor named Felix, who was a horrendous governor. There was another one named Festus, and he lived here too, and they're all in the Bible. This is where the Roman governors lived, right in here. Now the palace had two sections, actually more than that, but two major ones. This is the lower palace, as in lower in elevation because it was closer to the water. That's the upper palace, right in that area there. The upper palace contains a dungeon in there, place for political prisoners. Around the time of Passover, as you remember, the Apostle Paul for the last time was in Jerusalem, and he gets accused of bringing a Gentile inside the Soreg wall. No Gentiles past this point when you get near the temple. It was false, but that's what he was accused of. A riot breaks out. The Romans come down, they grab him right down from the Antonia fortress, grab him, pull him back up into the fortress. On the way up, he stops in the middle of the steps. He says, "Can I preach?" He preaches, and then another riot breaks out. They drag him further up. They threaten to flog him. He says, "Hey, I'm a Roman citizen. Are you allowed to do that?" Rhetorically, you're not allowed to do that. Of course you're not. And so he's in prison. As he's talking with his nephew in prison, because that's where you get your food. They don't feed you. They don't have a mess hall. If you want to eat, somebody's got to bring it to you. And so his nephew finds out about a plot that the Sanhedrin have taken a vow that they're not going to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead. They've got an ambush, and they knew that Paul was going to be moved in order to be put on trial in Jerusalem. So he tells his nephew, "Go tell the tribune." And the tribune finds out about it and immediately gets Paul escorted by a cavalry and a whole bunch of infantry, and he's escorted down here to Caesarea virtually overnight from Jerusalem. He's put in a dungeon somewhere down over there in that area. We don't know where, otherwise we'd be down there talking. We just don't know. But it was there. There he languishes for 2 years under Felix, who wants a bribe. You know, Felix is unscrupulous, so he's going to keep him there. He shows interest in Paul. He's talking with him, tell me more about what you believe. But the whole time he's got his hand out, like, just pay me and I'll get you out of here. Paul, the man who loves to preach, the man who loves to travel, who goes all over the place, he's in there for 2 years doing, as far as we know, nothing. Time for prayer and fasting. So there he is. Finally, Felix is set free. He's deposed, basically, and along comes this other guy, Festus. He only is a governor for a couple of years. He didn't live that long. Along with another fellow, Herod Agrippa. The first was dead. This is Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa II rules for a very long time. I mean, he goes all the way up through the Great Revolt and beyond, so he's a very important person. Herod Agrippa and his wife, Berenice, or Bernice, you might call her, may be his half-sister. It's somewhat of an incestuous relationship as far as we can tell. And he hears they've got this hot potato of a political prisoner in that dungeon, and he wants to find out more about it. So Festus calls in Agrippa and says, "What have we got here?" And if we don't know, let's find out. And so they bring Paul, the Bible tells us, to the Praetorium. Welcome to the Praetorium. And over in Acts 25, let me just read the passage here. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, where they were preparing to ambush him and kill him along the way. They're doing it again. This is 2 years later. Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he has done anything wrong." And after spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea. So Festus comes back here. This is where he lives anyway. And let me find my place here, sorry. And Festus answered, yeah, Paul is being cited. Here we go. And after spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered Paul to be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, and bringing many serious charges against him, they could not prove. You can see Paul standing here. This is where this is taking place. And those Jewish lawyers from up above are pointing at Paul, the Jew, and they're accusing him of all the things that they're accusing him of, which they couldn't substantiate. Verse 8, then Paul made his defense. Paul finally says, okay, let me talk. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. That tells you what they were accusing him of. So he would, the law of the Jews, he broke the law. He's been talking against the temple. The temple had become an idol to the Jewish people by that time, which was a tragedy. And of course against Caesar, which could get him crucified. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing, this happened here, these rocks heard him speak. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? Let's go back to Jerusalem. Let's talk about it there again. Go back on trial. We'll take you back up. That's deadly. And Paul knows it. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court. This is the throne of the governor here, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving of death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Those words were said here, where you're standing. Just thought I'd let you know. And I wanted to let you know one more thing. I don't always give you a sort of a devotional thought, but just something to think of, that when you see Paul called upon to give a defense, whenever he does give a defense, have you noticed he never defends himself? He never defends himself. What he does is he preaches his testimony. Defend yourself. Here's what Jesus did. Here's why I'm a changed man. I met him in Damascus, on the road to Damascus. Here's what happened next. You follow through whenever Paul is put on trial. And what does he do? Defend yourself. Yeah, it was Jesus. I met him. He changed my life. By the way, he can do it to you too. Never, never underestimate the power of your testimony. You say, I don't have a big, bad, gory testimony. I don't have a big, bad, gory testimony. But I've shared it countless times, and many, many people have come to the Lord, or seeds have been planted, whatever the case may be. You too. It's the same thing. Just tell people what Jesus has done in your life. Well, I'm not a preacher. Then show them what Jesus has done in your life by the way you treat others, by the way you love one another. But never underestimate the value of your testimony. It happened right here with the Apostle Paul a couple of thousand years ago, where you're standing. These stones, if they could talk, could tell you what his voice sounded like. So there you go. Let's move on.